Hey everyone, welcome back. It's time for another deep dive. And today we're going to be taking a look at something called the Advanced Agroecology Handbook.
Okay.
Um, and as you might guess, this is sort of like it's a guide, it's a roadmap
Mm-hmm.
to help people transition from industrial farming to more agroecological practices.
Right.
And to help us break this down and understand it,
Mm-hmm.
we have with us today.
Well, me.
Well, yes,
I'm here.
you are here. You are the expert.
That's right.
I'm so glad to have you here. So when we think about agroecology, I think a lot of those kind of think about like, oh, maybe it's organic farming or it's, just kind of like a different way to doing things. But this handbook really seems to take it to a whole other level. What is it about agroecology that's so unique? And why is this handbook trying to be like the go-to resource?
Well, it's interesting because agroecology is not just a set of practices.
Okay.
It really is, it integrates science, agricultural practice, and social equity.
Oh, wow.
So it's a broader,
So it's like a whole
that whole movement.
societal.
Yeah.
It's a paradigm shift.
Right.
It's a different way of looking at agriculture. And this handbook aims to sort of provide a roadmap for transitioning from industrial agriculture to agroecology.
I see. So it really is about like that kind of like changing the way we think about how we grow food.
That's right.
Yeah. Wow. Okay. So I'm already intrigued just from the get-go.
Yeah.
One of the things that really struck me when I was looking through this was the handbook's purpose. Like it's very clear from the beginning, like this isn't just, a textbook. It's not just a collection of, research papers. It has a very specific objective in mind.
Mm-hmm.
What is that objective? What are they trying to achieve?
The handbook aims to provide clear guidance for anyone who wants to move away from those conventional industrial farming practices and embrace a more agroecological approach.
Okay.
And it's really for everyone. You could be part of a small community or a larger group of people, but it aims to empower you to really take charge of food production and pave the way for a more sustainable future.
So it's not just for farmers.
No, it's for
It's really
everyone.
for everyone involved in the
Yeah.
seed system.
Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense because, we all eat. We're all part of that system in one way or another.
Absolutely.
So then who should be picking this up? Who's the intended audience? If it's not just farmers, who else are they trying to reach with this handbook?
Well, certainly farmers are a key audience, whether they've been practicing conventional methods or are already on the path to more sustainable practices. But it goes beyond that.
Okay.
Policymakers, researchers, students, even everyday consumers
Wow.
who are curious about where their food comes from and the impact it has on the planet can find valuable insights in this handbook.
Okay. So it really is, like you said, it's about everyone who has a stake in our food system, which is pretty much everyone.
Pretty much.
So we know like what they're trying to do. We know who they're trying to reach. Now, how did they actually put this together? Like, how is the handbook structured? What can people expect when they actually like open it up and start reading? Well, the handbook is broken down into chapters, each zeroing in on a specific aspect of agroecology.
Okay.
For instance, there's a chapter that compares agroecology to other sustainable farming approaches that you might already be familiar with,
Right.
like organic farming or regenerative agriculture.
Right. Which I think a lot of people get those confused, so it's nice to have it all kind of laid out.
That's right.
Yeah.
And there's a whole chapter devoted to transitioning from industrial farming to agroecology,
Oh, that's cool.
outlining the steps and the strategies that people can take.
Okay, so like practical advice,
Practical advice.
like how to actually make that shift.
Absolutely.
Cool. And are there any other kind of like interesting chapters that you think would really appeal to our listeners?
Well, there are chapters that delve into the nitty-gritty of agroecological practices.
Okay.
Things like managing soil health, conserving water, and dealing with pests,
Okay.
all without resorting to those harsh chemicals that we're trying to move away from.
Right. So like the actual hands-on stuff.
Yeah, the practical how-to.
And there's even a chapter that explores the role of communities and policy in making this transition happen.
Okay.
Because it's not just about what happens on individual farms.
Right.
It's about a larger societal shift.
The bigger picture thing.
Absolutely.
Wow. Okay. So this is starting to sound pretty cool. Like it's not just, like I said, it's not just like a dry textbook or something. This is like a guide to a whole new way of thinking about food and the environment.
It is.
Yeah. Okay. So
It's exciting.
yeah, it is exciting. So I think we should probably take a closer look at some of these chapters. Absolutely. Let's dive in.
All right. Let's do it.
One of the things that I thought was really interesting about this handbook is it talks about how agroecology isn't actually a new concept.
Huh.
It's really going back to more traditional ways of farming.
Yeah, like back to the basics almost.
Yeah, going back to, centuries old practices that a lot of cultures have used.
Right? Like I was thinking about it when I was reading through this. Like it's almost like we're rediscovering the wisdom
Yeah.
of, people who lived closer to the land.
Exactly. And the handbook actually gives examples of these practices.
Okay. Like what?
Well, one example is the Millpaw system.
The what?
The Millpaw system.
Okay, I've never heard of that.
It's a traditional Mesoamerican agricultural system where they grow maize, beans, and squash all together in the same field.
And why do they do that?
Well, it's really fascinating because each plant kind of supports the others.
Oh, wow.
So the maize stalks act as a natural trellis for the beans to climb.
Okay.
The beans fix nitrogen in the soil, which helps the other plants grow.
Oh, that's cool.
And then the squash leaves spread out on the ground, suppressing weeds and helping the soil retain moisture.
Wow. So it's like they all work together.
Exactly. It's like a symbiotic relationship.
That's really cool.
Yeah.
And you said that was in Mesoamerica? Are there other examples like that in other parts of the world?
Yeah, there are tons of examples. In Asia, they practice race fish culture, where they raise fish in rice paddies.
Oh, really?
And the fish help to control pests and fertilize the rice.
So it's like a little ecosystem.
Exactly. It's like a self-sustaining system.
That's amazing.
Yeah.
What about like in Africa or other parts of the world?
Well, in Africa, they practice rotational grazing, where they move livestock between different pastures,
Okay.
which prevents overgrazing and helps to promote plant diversity.
Oh, so that's like good for the land.
It's very good for the land.
Okay. Yeah, these are all really cool examples. It makes you wonder, like, why did we ever like stray away from these practices in the first place?
Yeah, well, the handbook kind of delves into that.
Right.
It talks about how in the 19th and 20th centuries, there was a big shift towards what they call modern agricultural science.
Okay.
And the focus became maximizing yields,
Right.
often through using chemical fertilizers, synthetic pesticides, and heavy machinery.
Yeah, like the Green Revolution kind of thing.
Exactly, the Green Revolution.
Which, I mean, it had its benefits. Like, it definitely increased food production. But I think we're starting to see now that it also had some negative consequences.
Yeah, absolutely. Like,
Clear.
the handbook talks about things like soil degradation,
Okay.
water pollution,
Right.
and the loss of biodiversity.
Yeah, so it's like we kind of traded, short-term gains for long-term problems.
Right, and the handbook acknowledges that.
Okay, so when did agroecology kind of start to emerge as like a counter movement to these practices?
Well, the handbook points to the 1970s and 80s
Okay.
as a pivotal period
Okay.
where pioneers like Miguel Altieri and Stephen Gleisman started formally studying agroecology.
Okay.
And they were really emphasizing the importance of applying ecological principles to farming systems.
So it was like a merging of science and traditional knowledge.
Exactly. It was about bringing those two worlds together.
Right, because I think sometimes people think of like traditional practices as being kind of like, old-fashioned or not scientific.
Right. But what these pioneers were doing was showing that there's actually a scientific basis for why these traditional practices work.
Well, that's interesting.
Yeah.
So it's like they were legitimizing it in a way.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Okay.
So we've gone from, ancient wisdom to the Green Revolution, and now we're kind of like circling back to this more balanced approach.
Right. It's like a natural progression.
Yeah. Okay. I'm liking this historical perspective.
It's important to understand the context.
Yeah, for sure. One thing that I thought was cool was that the handbook actually connects agroecology to the UN's Sustainable Development Goals.
Right.
Which is interesting because those are like global goals.
Exactly.
So it's like agroecology is part of a much bigger picture.
it's all interconnected.
Yeah. And how does it connect to those goals?
Well, a lot of the goals like zero hunger and clean water and sanitation,
Okay.
they naturally overlap with the principles of agroecology.
I see.
It's not just about fixing isolated problems. It's about creating a more sustainable world.
Right. It's like a ripple effect. Okay. So if we're talking about like transitioning to agroecology, like how do we actually know if we're successful? Like what does success look like in this context?
Well, the handbook emphasizes that it's not just about yields. It's
Okay.
not just about how much food we're producing.
Right.
It's about measuring environmental,
Okay.
economic, and social indicators.
So it's like a holistic view.
Exactly. It's about the bigger picture.
Okay. So can you give us some examples of like what those indicators might be?
Sure. So, from an environmental perspective, we would look at things like improvements in soil health,
Okay.
reduction in water pollution, and an increase in biodiversity.
Okay.
Economically, we would want to see greater profitability for farmers
Right.
and more resilient local food systems.
Oh,
And on a social level,
yeah.
it's about increased food security, fair wages for farm workers,
Mhm.
and thriving rural communities.
So it's like a win-win-win for everyone.
Exactly.
Okay, I like
Uh,
that. And the handbook also talks about the importance of monitoring these indicators.
Yes, monitoring is crucial.
And why is that?
Well, because it allows for what they call adaptive management.
Okay.
It's not about sticking to a rigid plan.
Right.
It's about constantly learning, adapting, and fine-tuning your practices based on the data you're collecting.
So it's like a continuous improvement process.
Exactly.
Okay, I'm getting a much clearer picture now of like what agroecology actually entails.
Good.
But let's be real for a second. Are there any downsides to this approach? Like what challenges might someone face if they want to make this shift?
Yeah, the handbook doesn't shy away from the challenges.
Okay.
And one of the biggest hurdles is the initial cost.
Okay, like what kind of costs?
Well, things like buying new equipment,
Right.
seeds for cover crops,
Okay.
investing in composting systems.
Yeah. That could be a barrier for some people.
It definitely can be. But the handbook also offers some strategies for mitigating those costs.
Like what?
Well, they encourage starting with small incremental changes,
Right.
seeking out grants and subsidies,
Right.
and even collaborating with other farmers.
That's a good idea.
Yeah, like sharing resources and knowledge.
Yeah, like a community effort.
Exactly.
Okay. What about other challenges?
Correct.
Like I imagine that some people might be resistant to change,
Yeah, that's another potential challenge.
like, people who are used to doing things a certain way.
Right. People can be attached to tradition.
Yeah. How do you suggest we overcome that?
Well, the handbook emphasizes communication and education.
Okay.
It's about patiently explaining the benefits of agroecology,
Right.
not just the environmental benefits, but also the economic and social advantages.
So it's about like showing them the bigger picture.
Exactly. And sometimes the most powerful way to do that is through real-world examples.
Okay.
The handbook actually shares some case studies of successful transitions to agroecology.
Oh, cool.
And those stories can be really inspiring.
Yeah, because it's like proof that it can be done. Okay. So we've talked about the principles of agroecology. We've talked about the challenges. Now let's get into the nitty-gritty. Like, what does this actually look like in practice?
Yeah.
What are some of the specific techniques that farmers are using?
Well, one of the fundamental practices is crop diversification.
Okay.
And the handbook talks about techniques like intercropping.
Intercropping.
Yeah, where you grow different crops together in the same field.
Okay.
It's like creating a polyculture.
Huh.
A polyculture,
Right.
which is like a mixture of different plants.
Okay, so like instead of just having a field of corn, you might have corn and beans and squash all growing together.
Exactly.
Okay. I've actually seen that. I visited a farm recently that was doing that, and it was really cool.
Yeah, it's becoming more popular.
Yeah. And why is that beneficial? Like, what are the advantages of doing that?
Well, it's beneficial for a lot of reasons.
Okay.
It can help to deter pests and diseases
Okay.
because the different plants kind of confuse the pests.
Oh, that's interesting.
And it can also improve nutrient cycling. Well, the different plants have different root systems,
Right.
so they draw nutrients from different layers of the soil.
Oh, that makes sense. So it's like they're not competing with each other.
Exactly. They're actually complementing each other.
Wow. That's really cool.
Yeah.
What other techniques does the handbook highlight?
Well, another key technique is crop rotation.
Crop rotation.
Yeah, where
Yeah.
you grow different crops in sequence on the same land over several years.
Okay. And what's the purpose of that?
Well, it helps to disrupt pest and disease cycles,
Okay.
and it also helps to improve soil fertility and structure.
So it's like giving the soil break.
Yeah, kind of like giving it a rest.
Okay. That makes sense.
Yeah.
So are there any other techniques that they talk about?
Yeah, the handbook goes into a lot of detail about different practices
Okay.
for managing soil health,
Okay.
conserving water,
Right.
controlling pests and weeds.
Okay.
And all of this is done without using those harmful chemicals that we're trying to move away from.
Right. So it's like a whole system.
Like a whole system.
It's not just like one or two things.
Exactly. It's about integrating all of these practices together.
Okay. I'm really starting to see the big picture here.
Good.
Okay. So we've talked about, diversifying crops, rotating crops.
Yeah.
But what about the soil itself? Like that seems like pretty important. I mean, you can't really grow anything without healthy soil.
Yeah, Absolutely. Soil health is like the foundation
Yeah.
of agroecology.
Okay. So what does the handbook say about that?
Well, it talks about a lot of different practices for building and maintaining healthy soil.
Okay. Like what?
One of the key things is building up soil organic matter,
Okay.
which basically means adding more organic material to the soil.
Okay. Like compost.
Like compost,
Okay.
exactly.
So how do they suggest doing that?
Well, composting is a big one,
Okay.
and also using cover crops.
Cover crops.
Yeah, which are plants that you grow specifically to improve the soil.
Okay. So you're not actually harvesting them.
No,
Yeah.
you're just growing them and then tilling them back into the soil.
Oh, that's interesting.
Yeah.
And why does that help?
Well, it adds organic matter to the soil,
Okay.
and it also helps to prevent erosion.
Oh, okay. So it's like a win-win.
Exactly.
And I know that water is also like a really big issue in agriculture.
Absolutely. Water management is crucial.
So what does the handbook say about that?
Well, it emphasizes the importance of conserving water
Okay.
and using it efficiently.
Right. Especially in places where water is scarce.
Exactly. And there are a lot of different techniques the farmers can use to do that.
Like what?
Well, things like rainwater harvesting
Okay.
and drip irrigation.
Drip irrigation. What's that?
Drip irrigation is a system where you deliver water directly to the roots of the plants.
Oh, okay. So you're not just like spraying it all over the place.
Right. It's much more targeted.
Oh, that's cool. And what about rainwater harvesting?
Rainwater harvesting is basically collecting rainwater
Okay.
and storing it for later use.
Okay, so you're like capturing the water that would normally just run off.
Exactly.
Wow.
Yeah.
These are some really clever ideas.
Yeah, farmers are getting really creative with water management.
That's awesome.
Yeah.
One last thing I wanted to ask about is pests and diseases. Like those are always a challenge for farmers.
Definitely pest and disease management is a big part of agroecology.
So what's the approach there?
Well, the focus is on prevention
Okay.
and using natural methods to control pests and diseases.
Okay, so like what kind of natural methods?
Well, one technique is using beneficial insects.
Beneficial insects.
Yeah, like ladybugs and lacewings
Yeah.
that prey on harmful insects.
Oh, so you're basically introducing good bugs to eat the bad bugs.
Exactly.
That's so cool.
And another technique is companion planting.
Companion planting.
Yeah, which is where you plant different crops together
Okay.
that help to deter pests.
Okay, so like certain plants will repel certain insects.
Right.
Oh, that's interesting. Like what kind of plant?
Well, marigolds are a good example.
Marigolds.
Yeah, they repel a lot of different pests.
Huh, I never knew that.
Yeah, it's pretty cool.
So are there any other natural methods that they talk about?
Yeah, they also talk about using biopesticides.
What about pesticides? What are those?
Biopesticides are pesticides that are derived from natural sources,
Right.
like bacteria or fungi.
Oh, wow. So they're not synthetic.
Right. They're more environmentally friendly.
That's great.
Yeah.
So it seems like agroecology is really about like working with nature.
Exactly. It's
Yeah.
about understanding the natural systems
Yeah.
and using them to our advantage.
Instead of trying to fight against them.
Right.
Yeah. Okay, so we've covered a lot of ground here. But what does all this mean for the average person? Like, how can someone who's not a farmer support this shift towards agroecology?
Well, I think the biggest thing is being a conscious consumer.
Okay, like what does that mean?
It means supporting local farmers,
Right.
choosing organic options whenever possible,
Right.
and being willing to pay a fair price for food that's produced sustainably.
So it's about voting with your dollars.
Exactly.
Okay. And what else can people do?
Well, you can also engage in conversations about these issues.
Ask questions at farmers markets.
Right.
And educate yourself.
Yeah. Knowledge is power.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And don't underestimate the power of sharing what you learn.
Right. Like telling your friends and family.
Exactly. Spreading the word.
Yeah. Okay. So it's not just about changing farming practices. It's about changing our mindset and our relationship with food.
I think that's a great way to put it.
Yeah. All right. Well, I think we've covered just about everything here. So to wrap up our deep dive into the Advanced Agroecology Handbook, I highly recommend checking it out if you're interested in learning more about sustainable agriculture.
It's a great resource.
Yeah, it's packed with information and practical advice.
Absolutely.
So if you're looking to make a difference, whether you're a farmer or a consumer, this handbook is a great place to start.
It's a call to action.
Yeah. All right. Well, that's it for today's deep dive. Thanks for listening.